Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, an offseason cap sheet snapshot. Slow-mo, Kyle Anderson, a free agent this offseason. How will the Wolves backfill that rotation spot with negative cap space? We'll talk about who will be a free agent, what trade assets the Timberwolves have, and where the likely roster turnover will come from this offseason. That's how we'll kick off this offseason here today on the show. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Happy Tuesday, everybody. And today we're going to jump into the cap sheet for the Wolves. And what I want to do is kind of just a quick snapshot. I don't want to get super in the weeds, but want to kind of build a jumping off point for the rest of the shows this offseason. We'll get into player reviews. Actually, on Wednesday's show, we'll go through the entire roster, almost like an exit interview style. What did we get from each player on the roster this season? But I think it's important to start with like who likely is gone next year, whose contract is up, restricted free agents, unrestricted free agents, which roster spots will likely need to be filled with new players or bringing back players somehow, some way that were on this year's team. So I want to start there today, talk about trade assets, talk about draft picks this year and upcoming picks that are becoming tradable this offseason for Minnesota that they could not have traded last offseason. A bevy of things to get to here. A big thank you off the top for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And you can follow on X at Locked On T Wolves and also at Beecken with two B's, two E's, CKEN. All right. Let's just walk through this. So everyone's talking about the second apron, and we'll get there. But the short version there, we covered this briefly on Monday, is basically the Timberwolves are over this. They're already over the first apron, or they're already over the soft cap is what it used to be called. Now the second apron is going to exist. The Timberwolves will be over that just by virtue of all the extensions kicking in that are yet to kick in. So let's just talk about roster spots first. Who's going to be a free agent? And because honestly, like the dollar values don't matter as much because they've already got three max guys on the books. That's not, the problem is there. The problem isn't with the rest of the roster necessarily in terms of the financials, but obviously it all adds up. So let's look at it this way. The Timberwolves had 8 rotation guys basically in the playoffs. And yes, Monte Morris was in there briefly, and Jordan McLaughlin had a couple of stints kind of quote unquote in the rotation, but they had 8 primary rotation guys. The 5 main starters, Naz Reid, Nickeil Alexander-Walker, and Kyle Anderson off the bench. Of those 8, 7 of them are under contract for next year. And in fact, Nickeil Alexander-Walker is the only one that's not under contract beyond next season of those players. Naz Reid's got 2 years on his deal. Of course, there's a player option in there, I think, for that final – not I think. I know for that final year. Mike Conley signed the extension, so he's got 2 more years. Jaden McDaniels signed the extension. He's got a lot more years. Gobert actually does have a player option for the 25-26 season. He becomes extension eligible this offseason. So both Naz and Gobert could opt out after next year. At the moment, I'm sure Gobert's going to try and negotiate an extension now, and we can get more into that certainly when we get to his player review. Naz, why wouldn't he opt out after next year to try and get a bigger deal? So all that to say, though, this offseason for this year, Nickeil Alexander-Walker, Kyle Anderson is the only one that's not under contract. Everybody else from their top 8 is under contract for next season. That's a really positive team, or positive thing for a team that just went to the conference finals. So that here is the story. 7 of 8 under contract. We'll talk about slow-mo here in a second. The other guys that are going to be gone next season, I should say this a different way, whose contracts are up. So Kyle Anderson's number 1. And Monte Morris, who was acquired at the trade deadline, Jordan McLaughlin, TJ Warren, who was a post-trade deadline signing. Those are the other three guys that were on standard contracts that will be free agents. So there's four total. Kyle Anderson, Monte Morris, Jordan McLaughlin, and TJ Warren. Two-way guys, Luka Garza and Daishen Nix. Now, Garza ended up on a standard contract, but he's a restricted free agent, and Daishen Nix is a restricted free agent, a two-way restricted free agent. Jalen Clark, last year's second-round pick, signed a two-year, two-way deal before last season because they knew he was out the whole year. So he's already one of the Wolves' 3 two-way players for next season. So he's still under contract. So 4 standard, I guess technically 5 standard contract guys, if you include Luka Garza, are gone or are free agents, with Garza being the only one that's restricted off of a standard contract. The other non-rotation guys that are under contract, so we talked about the 7 rotation guys, Towns, Gobert, Edwards, McDaniels, Nas, Conley, Alexander Walker. The other 4 guys under contract, guaranteed contracts for next year, well, I guess 3, not including Jalen Clark, are Wendell Moore Jr., Josh Minott, and Leonard Miller. Moore and Minott were from the draft class a couple of years ago, and both have options that the team's going to need to pick up later in the offseason. And I would expect them to, although the Wendell Moore one's an interesting one, because if they don't believe he's a rotation guy in this cap crunch, do you want to pay him $4.5 million next year, which I think that's roughly what his deal goes up to. For almost $4.6 million. It'd be weird. Like, it's very rare that teams don't pick up all, those 3rd and 4th year options on a 1st round pick, but Moore has not played, and the Wolves are strapped for cap space. Minott, I think, is a no-brainer. It's only $2.2 million for and again, the options for the 25-26 season. It's not for this upcoming season. So Minott's a no-brainer. I think they'll probably still pick up Morris, but we could have that conversation. And then Leonard Miller has a fully guaranteed $1.9 million this year, and then a non-guaranteed $2.2 million the following year. The Leonard Miller and Minott thing, that's related to the Kyle Anderson conversation that we'll get back to. But that's where we sit right now. So really only one rotation spot, one playoff rotation spot of a top 8. But then you look at, a top 9, top 10, and who were those guys when this team was fully healthy? Well, it was the point guard spot. So first Jordan McLaughlin earlier in the season, and then Monte Morris. And before the deadline, Shake Milton and Troy Brown Jr. were in the rotation. Post-deadline, the rotation shrunk by 1. And yeah, it was in and out. Like, Shake eventually lost his spot, and Troy Brown wasn't in it, and then he was, and then he wasn't in it. So you're really talking 10 guys that see minutes, 9 that see regular rotation minutes, and 8 of a core rotation. So you're talking about at least 2 spots in a regular season rotation and 1 spot in a playoff rotation that the Wolves are going to need to figure out how to fill with negative cap space. They're going to be over the second apron. So what I want to do is I want to talk about Slow-Mo's role, how the Timberwolves might go about filling Kyle Anderson's role next season. And then I want to kind of set the draft pick stage, both for this season, what the Wolves have this year, heading into what's universally thought of as a very weak draft, and then what trade assets, what draft picks / trade assets the Wolves have coming available this offseason that they can use in any pending moves here upcoming. So we'll do that after we talk Slow-Mo. Related to the Slow-Mo conversation is I want to talk Minott, and I want to talk Leonard Miller as well. So we'll get to all of that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our title sponsors at FanDuel. It's winner take all in the NBA and the NHL right now. We are down to the finals in each sport. FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. Right now in the finals, Game 1 is still not until Thursday night. And the Boston Celtics are 6.5-point favorites. And this is just for Game 1. Money line for the Celtics is minus 255. And I think the Celtics will win the series, but I've kind of gone back and forth on this. I think it's a 6 or 7 game series. I don't think they're going to put him away. But if Luka plays like how he did in 4 of the 5 games against Minnesota, I mean, hey, this thing could, if he's the best player on the floor, and he should be, Jason Tatum's great, a top 10 player, but Luka's a top 3 player. I don't know. Dallas plus 6.5 doesn't look awful for Game 1 of the finals. Overall for the finals, the Celtics are minus 220, and the Mavs are plus 184. Luka at plus 200 for NBA Finals MVP. I don't hate that. Tatum, of course, is the favorite. at -120. So go check that all out over at FanDuel. Visit FanDuel.com/lockdown and make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day long? If so, no doubt you have to turn down the volume because of all the shouting. Instead, make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. All right. Let's talk about the Kyle Anderson rule. So, and of course, we'll talk more about this as well, like obviously throughout the next several weeks, but we get to the Kyle Anderson player review probably early to mid next week, probably early next week, where we'll talk about how Slow-Mo performed this year relative to expectations, what his role was, his offseason outlook, and what the Wolves, will they bring him back? If not, how will they fill the role? So I want to do kind of a micro version of that today, a mini version of it today. Slow-Mo, when the Wolves signed him a couple off seasons ago, was a really nice deal. A 2-year, $18 million contract, basically $8.8 million the first year and then $9.2 million this last year. In year one, he was a complete bargain. He was fantastic. He played a lot at the 4. He was a godsend when Karl-Anthony Towns missed, 50-plus games with the calf. And Slow-Mo stepped into the starting lineup, played a lot of minutes with him at the 4. Having Nas was kind of a luxury. Then with the Nas contract and a mostly healthy cap this year, we knew that Kyle Anderson was going to play more at the 3, and he just isn't as good at the 3. His best minutes in his career were with Memphis at the 4 and even some minutes at the 5 with the Grizzlies. And he was really good. He had some of the best offensive numbers in his career, certainly his best three-point shooting percentage last season, 22-23, when playing at the 4 for Minnesota when Cat was out. But the role that he played, perhaps most importantly for the Wolves, was Chris Finch always would call him his Swiss Army knife. And he was that way on both ends of the floor. And yeah, the shooting limitations were real. The spacing struggled, especially when he was on the floor with Rudy Gobert. But he was a playmaker who could be a zone buster, stand in the middle, stand at the nail, distribute to teammates when teams played a zone, which is a relatively limited. Like, how often are you really dealing with that? There's like maybe one game a year where he saves the team by doing that, which is maybe even a little bit dramatic. Defensively, he can guard basically 4 positions. Depending on the 1, depending on the 5, like some 1s and 5s, but he can guard a good chunk of 2s and pretty much most 3s and 4s. We saw him do as good a job as anybody in the Timberwolves conference finals showing against Luka Doncic and the Mavs in terms of guarding Luka. Whereas in the Denver series, Kyle Anderson was basically unplayable. And he missed a game in the Phoenix series, and it wasn't a big deal. He didn't look great in that series either. But he was important in the Dallas series. So the ability to guard multiple positions, to be a secondary ball handler, playmaker, especially with the bench unit, is important for Kyle Anderson. And it was really important the middle stages of the season, even though he was struggling offensively when Jordan McLaughlin was also struggling. And the Wolves obviously didn't trust Daishen Nix enough to play him, despite the fact he was on a 2-way deal all season. I think Daishen Nix saw rotation minutes in like 1 game all season. I should say non-garbage time minutes. But they didn't fully trust Nickeil Alexander-Walker to run the offense, and Shake Milton never really figured that out. So it became Kyle Anderson as kind of the de facto point guard and the initiator on offense for Minnesota, and he did a good job overall doing that. And it's a luxury to have a guy who, like, Kyle Anderson is not great at any of these things, but he's good at almost all of them except for shooting. And, he doesn't – but the length and the IQ defensively and the size defensively is really important. The physicality he can play with. And then he had these stretches during the season where he was super turnover prone or whatever. And it really it kind of defeated the purpose of Kyle Anderson being on the floor, because if he's going to make those mistakes, it cancels out all the other stuff. But no matter how you slice it, he's a rotation guy in a 56-win team that you have to replace. He made $9.2 million last year. How are you going to fill those minutes? Is it going to be a Denver Nuggets, this year version of the Denver Nuggets, where it's let your Jeff Green and your Brian Brown walk because you have to, because of the cap crunch pretty much? and you backfill it with second-year guys like a Christian Brown, or attempt to do it with rookies and guys like Julian Strawther and Peyton Watson and Zeke Naji, and guys who ultimately were not part of your playoff rotation or your optimal playoff rotation? Or is it find a vet minimum guy? Or is it both? I tend to think it's both. Certainly you have to fill the roster somehow, and we'll get more into this as we, move through the offseason. But I think the Wolves will try to bring in, the TJ Warren, hopefully a sprier version of TJ Warren, but somebody that can approximate the value of Kyle Anderson as a vet, but then give the opportunity to somebody like the Leonard Miller in training camp in preseason to take the horns of that role. Now, is Leonard Miller ready? Well, we're going to talk again. This is a preview of something we'll talk about in more depth later. Leonard Miller, got no chance at the NBA level, and understandably so this year, for a really good team, right? He only played in 17 games. It was all garbage time. His G League stats, he was drafted out of the G League. So that's his professional experience, is as a G League player before being drafted, and then this year in relatively limited action with the Iowa Wolves. He ended up playing, he ended up playing 12 games in the Showcase Cup and 20 games in the regular season. That's a decent sample. It's actually not that much less than he did with the G League Ignite the year prior. But he played better. He was improved over what he did with the G League Ignite. He averaged 20 points per game, 38% from three, 48% from the floor. Rebounding was down a little, but the assists were up and the turnovers were way down. So I'm going to watch some of his games from the G League from this year to prep for talking about him this offseason. Haven't had a chance to go fully back and do, watch any additional after the season yet. But clearly the numbers say he improved in his second year in the G League. And he's a guy who a lot of people talked about having a first-round grade on, or a possible first-round grade. And the Wolves got him at a bargain, essentially. And they ended up picking him 33rd. He was the third pick of the second round last year. They moved up to get him. He's also only 20 years old. So I don't think the Wolves are planning to plug him into the playoff rotation or the regular season rotation from opening night next year. However, the skill set that Leonard Miller has is the souped up version of what Kyle Anderson is. Now, the two as athletes, we're not going to try and compare them. There's differences. Kyle Anderson is the superior facilitator right now, but the ceiling for Leonard Miller is legit starter level plus. I mean, I said this last year when they drafted him. So there is a world in which the Wolves say, look, we're strapped for cash. We can't figure this out. I shouldn't say we can't figure this out. There isn't a clearly optimal path forward to acquiring somebody to fill the Kyle Anderson role at $9 million a year, because we just don't have that kind of cap space. So let's bring in a vet minimum, a TJ Warren type guy. Let's have Leonard Miller kind of battle it out for some rotation minutes early in the season. And, go back to what Denver did early last year, and the Strawthers and the Najis and the Peyton Watsons of the world were in the rotation early in the season. By the end of the season, they weren't as much. And Peyton Watson still was. But for the most part, these guys weren't playing. The Wolves may try something similar and hope they have better luck with Leonard Miller. Is Leonard Miller ready at 20 and eventually 21 years old late next season to play for a conference finals type team? Probably not. But he's also now played professionally for 2 years in the G League and improved quite a bit from year one to year two. Has been in the organization now for a full year. And again, without getting too deep into the overall skill set and everything, I mean, talking about basically a point forward. That's the idea behind Leonard Miller. I mean, he's 6'10", 7'2" wingspan. The way I described him when they drafted him last year was like a super version of Jared Vanderbilt, but with offensive touch and upside, better around the rim, and also just a better shooter. He's not a great rebounder, but again, some of that is similar to Kyle Anderson. He's certainly thinner, maybe not quite as physical. He's not going to be as good defensively, but there is upside defensively too. So again, I keep talking about upside. All that to say, he could be a reasonable facsimile of what Kyle Anderson is. The irony here is that the security blanket, Swiss Army knife stuff, all the vet stuff that Kyle Anderson brought to the table, that won't be there for Leonard Miller. So this could be a front office Chris Finch push and pull, where Chris Finch says, I need a vet. I need my security blanket. And the front office says, well, Leonard Miller is the souped up version skill-wise. Let's make this work. And the compromise is very likely bringing somebody else in, but like that role is what Leonard Miller, the fully realized version of Leonard Miller, is a better version of Kyle Anderson, in my opinion, with more offensive juice, even potentially more defensive versatility. I think that all that is possible. So something to keep an eye on. And certainly we'll get back to it here this offseason. Let's close by talking about draft assets and what to expect. Well, both draft assets coming available down the road that the Wolves can actually start trading this year on draft night. And then we'll also talk about this year's draft, the picks the Wolves have. And we'll get to all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends at BetterHelp. This episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. We all carry around different stressors, big and small. When we keep them bottled up, it can start to affect us negatively. Therapy is a safe space to get things off your chest and to figure out how to work through whatever's weighing you down. And look, for Timberwolves fans, certainly the end of the way that the season ended. I mean, I didn't pick them to beat Phoenix in the first round. I did pick them to beat Denver, but not in the fingernail biting fashion that they did, going down 20 plus in the third in game 7 and coming back to beat Denver. And I did not think there was any way that this Dallas series was going to end in 5 games. I picked the Wolves in 6. I thought for sure it would go 6 or 7 if the Wolves were to lose it. And they lost in 5 at the hands of Luka Doncic, and it wasn't all that close. That's challenging. It's challenging to deal with if you have high hopes and people picking the Wolves to win the whole thing after the win over the Nuggets in game 7. And look, I understand a lot of people have a lot of things going on that are a lot more significant than the Wolves. But look, we've all got different things we're dealing with, and it all matters, right? If you're thinking of starting therapy, consider giving BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Get it off your chest with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA. All right. So draft pick wise, the Timberwolves this season actually do have their first round pick. And I know that that's it goes against conventional wisdom because everyone talks about how they traded all their picks. Well, it's not exactly how that works. Remember, you can't actually trade consecutive picks in consecutive years, or I should say picks in consecutive years because of the stepping rule. So the Wolves didn't have their pick last year. They do have it this year. They don't have it next year. And then the pick swaps start where they didn't technically trade the pick, but there can be pick swaps, which is like the workaround, right? That's how teams can work around the stepping rule. They do now have more picks that have come available to trade. We'll talk more about that in a second. But this year, the Timberwolves have the number 27 pick in the draft in what's the weakest draft in recent memory, according to draft experts. I have not, full transparency, dug fully deep into this draft class yet. I will. I didn't have to last year because the Wolves didn't have a first-round pick, so it was more of a surface level, like, hey, if the Wolves are in the draft, here's who I would target. This year, I'm going to have to be very familiar with the end of the first round and the start of the second round. And I'm going to do that, and we're going to talk about it in this show. I'm going to watch a lot of college basketball, a lot of prospect video, etc. here over the next few weeks. But the Timberwolves, as of right now, have the number 27 pick in the draft, 1 pick ahead of Denver, who are at number 28. And I was going to see real quick if I could find, why can I not see who's got, it doesn't really matter who's got 29, but 30 is Boston. Well, obviously, and 29 then be OKC. It's got to be OKC. OKC has I don't know, they don't. Oh, it's Utah. Utah is the number 29 pick. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. The Thunder have a ton of overall picks moving forward. They've only got 12 in this draft. Minnesota has 27, and they've got 37. Now, last year, Leonard Miller was the 33rd pick. They got Jalen Clark later in the second round. And a couple of years ago, they got Wendell Moore in the first round, and they drafted Josh Minot in the second round, which the Wendell Moore pick, obviously jury's out on Josh Minot as well. I think Minot could be, he's another guy. I guess we didn't spend much time on him today, but I like the idea of him as a rotation guy potentially soon here for the Wolves, as we were talking about earlier, as somebody who potentially could get a shot here at rotation minutes. So all that to say, 27th pick and 37th pick this year. Weak draft. Could they package them, move into the teens? Maybe, probably not that high. You're probably not moving up more than a couple of slots with the 37. Surely the Wolves will try and trade out of the first round. Yes, but so is everybody else. Everyone's going to try and trade out of the first round. Every single team on the board, save for, maybe even the top couple of picks, would trade their pick for a future first round pick. And just one for one, like just give me one next year. Give me one in 2 or 3 years. Because that's how weak this year's draft is. So I don't think the Wolves will succeed in moving out of 27 unless there's a team that falls in love with the guy who they think is going to be there and they make a move for him at 27. 37, of course, those high second-round picks are still very valuable, whether it's draft and stash or being able to put them on a two-way deal like the Wolves did with Jalen Clark, or partially guaranteed deal like they did with Leonard Miller, or going back further, what they did with Jalen Noel, because he was a bargain, for a couple years when he was on the team. So, like legit draft capital in this draft, kind of middle of the pack in terms of draft value, or the value of the 27 and 37 picks for the Wolves. It's also important to note that in terms of assets to trade, the Timberwolves are now allowed to, starting the night of this year's draft, they can trade this year's pick, and they can also trade their 2031 pick. Again, because of the protected picks and the pick swaps. So, like next year, the Wolves don't have their first round. They do in 26. That Utah has the right to swap. So if Minnesota's pick ends up worse than Utah, they would switch with Utah in 26. They still have a pick in 26, but it'll be the worst of theirs and Utah's. 27, they also don't have. They give that to Utah. 28, I believe the Wolves still have their pick in 28. And then in 29, it's a top 5 protected pick to Utah, which means that they could not trade it in 30. And now they're allowed to trade their 31 if they need to, because it's 10 years out. Or no, not 10 years. Math. 7 years out. So they'll be able to trade the 2031 first. So all that to say, the only draft assets the Wolves have to trade in terms of first round picks are this year's, which won't be worth much, and their 2031 first. And then they, of course, have future second round picks as well. They've got theirs, or actually it's not theirs. I think it's it might be Utah's this year. I think that was part of the D'Lo Conley trade. They have theirs. They have a second rounder this year, early 37. They've got some additional future second rounders as well. So there are some trade assets available. I don't know that draft night trade is in the cards for Minnesota, but it's certainly possible. We talked about the other day. We talked about on the postcast last Friday. I talked about it on Friday's show. I talked about it on Monday's show. Potential need for a playmaker, a secondary creator, not necessarily like Kyle Anderson, but like a the easy comparison right now, which is like a really high level comparison. Kyrie to Luka. Who's going to be the Kyrie to Luka for the Wolves? Who's going to be the whoever to Ant? Who's going to be Ant's Kyrie in Minnesota? Well, it could be Karl-Anthony Towns if the Wolves figure out their offense, or is it going to be somebody in the backcourt? That brings up the trade conversation, which we'll cover another day. But there's a lot that the Wolves need to solve. Wing creation, shot creation from the wing spot or from the backcourt is certainly something the Wolves will be looking at. Setting up the rest of the week, I do want to dig into player reviews before we get too deep down the trade rabbit hole, because I just think it's important. It's fresh. Let's talk about all the guys on the roster. We've got lots of time to talk about trades. Nothing's happening in the next couple of weeks anyway. Plenty of time from a trade perspective, I should say, because, of course, we've got the finals. So we will talk trades. We will talk potential cat trades, not because I want it to happen, but because it's possible that it does happen. I gave my take Monday. If you want to hear my take, I don't think cat's traded. I certainly think it's possible. Both are true. So listen to my show, the show from Monday, to hear my full take on that. We'll talk about potential cat trades. We'll talk about, is it possible Nas is traded? I think it's even less likely he's traded than Cat, but we got to talk about the possibility, talk about potential Rudy extension, other possible moves the Wolves could make. But again, cap strapped, right? They just don't have any wiggle room here. So how are they going to get better? And again, on Monday, I talked about Tim Connolly's exit interview quote, where he told the media, hey, what's the linear improvement look like from here to the title? We were one of the final 4 teams and technically final 3 teams because the Pacers were swept in the East. So any one of these teams could have won the title. maybe not the Pacers, but any one of these teams could have won the title. He didn't say these words, but like, what more do we do? How do we get better? It's health and it's matchups. He did say that. Health and matchups are the biggest thing once you get to this level. Once you're one of the final four, health and matchups really matter. So lots to get to. Again, Wednesday, I want to start player reviews. We will start two-way guys. We'll start end of the roster, younger players that didn't play as much, and we'll work our way up. By next week, we'll be into the thick of the rotation. I think even by the end of next week, we'll be at the top of the rotation. We'll be talking Ant, Cat, Rudy, Stars. That's what we'll talk about by the latter part of next week. So lots to get to here in the next couple of weeks. Of course, the finals start Thursday night. We'll talk a little about that as well. A big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. No matter where you listen to podcasts, you can find this show. You can also watch on YouTube, and you can follow on X at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken. You can also watch the show on Locked On Sports Minnesota on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.